Good morning. My name is Mark Silver. I've been presenting a series of programs. I'm a forensic psychiatric social worker in New York City with a background in psychology. I'm also a lawyer. I've done numerous continuing legal education programs for immigration, criminal, and civil litigation lawyers for many years now. And I've decided to put them all on YouTube as well so that they're completely free and accessible to everybody. However, I've also received various questions over the years and issues that lawyers have wished me to address. And so I'm adding within this YouTube series an attempt to hopefully try and tackle some of these issues. I work primarily assisting lawyers to help humanize the client's case and understand particular issues. I've been at it in my forensics practice since about 2002. And one of the recurrent concerns pertains to the value of a psychosocial evaluation, which I've spoken about at length in different CLEs. And I will have a specific CLE just on the psychosocial evaluation versus testing. Testing in which it's paper and pen tests of different kinds to look at the person's personality, particular issues with regard to perhaps trauma, major depressive disorder, and so on. And I want to speak a little bit about it today. I don't do tests. I do psychosocial evaluations. That's my expertise. And I believe you can understand just about everything about a person through a psychosocial. I want to start off on this brief program today by just giving a story, and it concerns a client I had many years ago. This goes back about 5-6 years, and he was seen in jail in Brooklyn. It was Queens. He had grown up in a lower socioeconomic community in New York City, had dealt with all sorts of racial issues. He had suffered various abuse and neglect by his father, his mom. There's a history of alcohol and drugs in his home, a very significant history of violence and drugs in his community, misogyny. A large number of his friends would drop out of school. Truancy was common. Multiple issues. There were also developmental issues, educational concerns, and so on. And I saw this individual, and as I do, I see an individual usually 2, 3, 4 times, sometimes several hours each visit. And I wrote up the psychosocial for the purpose of criminal mitigation for pre-sentencing. It was a CJA case, as I remember. And a lawyer who used to be in this office said, he had been familiar with a very similar kind of case with a very similar client who'd also grown up in a low socioeconomic community in New York, who's faced very similar challenges and had suffered rather similar traumas and issues, both within his family, personally, within his community, and so on. And he said the client that he was familiar with had undergone a battery of tests, including the MMPI and so on, and would I like to see the psychologist's neuropsychological report? And I said, sure. And, it's a little intimidating, I have to tell you, because in my line of work, I don't do testing, I do clinical evaluations. And anyway, I read this neuropsychologist's evaluation. She had done a battery of tests, I think 8, 9 different tests over a period of several days or weeks for a client who was very, very similar to the client that I was seeing for criminal mitigation in this federal case. And what struck me as incredibly amazing was that I did no testing whatsoever, and she did all this testing, but her conclusions and my conclusions about this individual were almost exactly the same. Concerns about the client's development, his privations as a child, challenges and humiliations he suffered because of abuses and trauma, self-esteem issues because of developmental and educational delays in school, abandonment by core caregivers at early points in his childhood, contending with a violent, drug-filled community in his immediate neighborhood where he was growing up. All these issues and the psychological and emotional ways that this client had contended with them, as I wrote about it as conclusion in my psychosocial evaluation, were strikingly similar to what the psychologist had written after doing all of her testing. And the bottom line is that a very good clinician using a psychosocial model, really a bio-psychosocial model, can elicit core and central material from the client that yields, I think, excellent quality information that provides insight into the person's life challenges and so on, as well as any series or battery of tests. I'm not here to denigrate tests. I think testing has a real role and it can contribute in various ways, but there are also some limitations. But I wanted to start off with that anecdote about my own work as a criminal mitigation expert. One of the core issues with testing is that testing is not clinical per se. It's based on a research tool that's used and implemented for a particular client or even series of clients. When you get a report from, for example, one of my psychosocial reports, everything in the report is understandable. You don't have to have any clinical background understanding whatsoever. Everything will be clinical. You may have to look up a word or two in the dictionary, but I really don't use jargon. But everything in the report will be understandable. With tests, you cannot understand the research tool itself unless you really understand qualitative and quantitative research. You can't understand how that test was made to be accepted for validity purposes, for clinical purposes, and so on. And so the lawyers, the judge, jurors, or whoever's involved in reading this will look at the test and discard it, but only consider conclusions, because the body of the test itself is only truly understandable to experts in the particular field. In other words, the body of the report of the test is ignored by the reader, and only the conclusion is accepted, if it's accepted at all. In contrast with a psychosocial evaluation, from the first line to the last line, everything can be understood, everything can be internalized by the judge or lawyer, whoever's reading it, and it's based on a clinical evaluation, which in some ways is frankly even intuitive and humanistic. Another major concern is that research tools are frankly not very good at capturing cross-cultural considerations and concerns. It's particularly not good with the clients that I see. My specialty is criminal mitigation, not only for criminal lawyers, but also for immigration defense lawyers. I see a lot of clients who relocate to the United States who've suffered all sorts of trauma in their country of origin because of the ubiquity of poverty, social and political unrest, government corruption, police ineptitude, misogyny, a wide range of problems, including alcohol and drugs and so on. Many of these clients fear authority. They are not particularly psychologically minded. Many of these clients have perhaps a grade 6 education, often less. The clients are very poor at self-advocacy and so on. So when you get a self-report test that is given by a psychologist to one of these clients, it's difficult to really gain a sense if this client properly engages in the instrument and if cross-cultural considerations are really properly accounted for. You know, it's my belief that when you take these tests, you have to have a pretty good idea of your own emotions, behavior, thinking, and so on, because you're doing this very privately. And this is another limitation or concern about tests. When I speak to a client and I'm doing a clinical evaluation, there's a lot of give and take, and I answer, the client answers, and I may at times allow the client to speak off the top of their head for several minutes or more. And there are just as often periods where I will frequently interrupt the client or interject for clarification to understand how the client perhaps tries to explain a certain matter that could be misinterpreted by me or whatever. You don't have that with a test. You don't have an expert, you don't have the tester step in with concerns of how the client understands himself or cross-cultural issues or whatever. The client or whoever's taking the test simply fills out the test as such, and in that sense it's research-based and not, I guess, what I would call clinically oriented per se. In the old days, you'd go to a doctor's office and the doctor would ask you, dozens and dozens of questions. Now you go to a doctor's office, including psychiatric offices, frankly, emergency rooms and so on, and there's a 5-6 page form to fill out answering questions about your health. I have certain healthcare issues that have been monitored over the years, and I'm very aware, having gone to a wide range of different doctor's offices, that I get this form to fill out when I walk in. And, I'm always in a bad mood when I fill out these forms because I don't think it captures the issues that I'm frankly concerned about. We don't want patients simply volunteering information on a blank form. Clinically, we want to elicit information from the client by a clinical expert in an atmosphere where the client feels trust, the client feels relaxed, and so on. When a client fills out questions on a test, it's difficult to know when the client is stumbling, when the client is for a moment, very self-conscious about something. That's not true in clinical evaluations. In clinical evaluations, I am always hypervigilant, always very careful to note when the client stumbles, when the client fidgets with his or her hands, perhaps indicating anxiety or concern about a particular question. I'm always concerned when a client shifts in his or her seat. I'm concerned when the client, when explaining something, suddenly changes direction in his or her explanation and perhaps even brings in an extraneous matter. So the standardized questionnaires that are now that are ubiquitous really in doctors' offices are unhelpful. They're unhelpful because it's not clear to what extent the person who's filling out these questionnaires take them seriously, regard them seriously, and so on. I even want to know about the person's mood. I had a case, this was last year, and the client came in and he was just in a terrible mood. And his wife was very upset with him, and the wife actually ended up leaving. And it was so important as a starting point, rather than giving him a test, to understand why he was in a bad mood. He was angry at himself for committing a crime. It was a white-collar case. He was disappointed in himself. He felt he had let down his wife and his children. So far from being something negative, and perhaps if it was a test he was being given, he would just fill it out and not take it seriously and just get rid of it. I took this client's bad mood and irritability at the outset when we started the evaluation. It was the very first time I'd met him, and used it as a jumping off point for something very positive to understand what turned out to be his remorse and contrition about the wrongdoing, because he was so angry and frankly disappointed at himself. Particular issues, this is another concern I have, may not be met with proper nuance. And I'll give you a huge example. Sleep. On many questionnaires, there is concern about a person's sleep. Sleep is a huge topic. It's one of the most important things in our life. It takes up approximately a third of our lives. A questionnaire may have a question regarding the client's sleep. Is it good, not so good? But sleep, is often not consistent over the period of a night or even over a period of many days. A client may get up 2, 3, 4 times in the middle of the night. It may be because they have to urinate. It may be because of anxiety. It may be because they have obsessive thoughts that prohibit them from properly relaxing. A client may say they have a good night's sleep on paper, but when you ask them, what they really mean is they sleep from 2 a.m. until 8 a.m., which is 6 hours, which isn't terrible, but you want to know why they're not getting to sleep until 2 a.m. There's so much about sleeping, including medical issues such as sleep apnea, which is a respiratory concern. And these kinds of nuances for particular clinical issues, which may spider out into all sorts of different areas that you can ask about, don't necessarily have the opportunity to manifest itself in any clear way in a self-report test. And as I mentioned before, I want to know the client's reaction as I'm talking, and we're talking about this sort of thing. If we're talking about, the client's sleep, a very common thing I see is clients who have suffered night sweats or night terrors, nightmares, and so on. I want to know the content of the bad dream, to what extent the client can relate it to their everyday life. Do they recognize any scenes or individuals or any context that perhaps could give some insight into their current concerns or anxiety or whatnot? So again, there are nuances about specific clinical issues that can actually be understood not only in a more nuanced way, but that really spider out in ways that wouldn't be clear and understandable with just a paper and pencil test. At the end of the day, as I've tried to explain to clients since I started over 2 decades ago, the forensic psychosocial evaluation is meant to humanize the client through a sympathetic narrative and induce empathy into the reader, contextualize the client's history, and explain about their psychological developmental issues, community ties, and so on. These things I find cannot really be captured in a formal test. In particular, a client's external issues, his community ties, volunteer work, education, progress, employment ties, and so on, are also difficult to capture. Another huge area is that development occurs from the moment we're born until our death. And it's not unusual for development to have pockets of positive growth and to have pockets of a negative experience and so on. This is very typical in school. It's rather difficult to predict who's going to do well I know this goes against the grain, but who's going to do well in life when they're young, just looking at test scores? And when testing is done on adults, what we often miss out on is that individuals have had strengths and weaknesses in school. They've had positive experiences and negative experiences and so on. And tests don't really capture the development that children, adolescents, young adults, and even adults experience in a way that allows the reader to understand the highs and lows, the strengths and weaknesses, the assets and the deficits that a person has experienced and encompassed, particularly at early phases of development. For criminal cases, I just never feel that testing truly captures a client's remorse, regret, contrition, and so on. Psychosocial evaluations, particularly for criminal mitigation, really has the opportunity to allow professional expression to replace self-expression. That is, clients who cannot express themselves because of limited education or mental health problems or whatnot, fear of authority, whatever it is, can still have their narrative explained through professional expression because their self-expression is so limited. And I find with testing at times we forget this. The psychosocial evaluation, it's not just a mental health report. It captures holistically a person's experience from their early childhood onward in a way that doesn't focus just on psychiatric issues, as important as they are, but really a broader developmental and holistic understanding of the individual throughout their life. There are also, I think, conceptual assistance issues. There's conceptual parts of a psychosocial evaluation and the conclusions that I think could be very helpful to the lawyer, the courts, to understand who the individual is, that I don't think can always be captured through paper and pencil testing. Another major issue is that a lot of prosecutors, whether it's immigration court, criminal court, whatnot, have biases and prejudices and may develop false assumptions about the client for whatever reason. And part of the goal of the psychosocial evaluation is to dispel non-existent patterns of behavior and to crush prosecutorial bias or prejudice that may occur. Prosecutors may feel very angry or hostile towards the client because of their wrongdoing, whether it's a white-collar case or pornography or whatnot. The prosecutor may have felt that the individual may have squandered what may otherwise be an envious lifestyle. And, I often feel that those kinds of things can only be tackled through a psychosocial evaluation. There's a wide range of issues within contrition and remorse that also, I think, can only be captured through a psychosocial evaluation. Many clients have undertaken an aberrant decision in a moment of poor judgment, and describing the client's flaw in this way, rather than saying the client did something wrong in a very kind of concrete black and white way, is necessary. Many clients have, especially in white-collar cases, but other cases as well, have undertaken really misguided behavior, profound errors in judgment that have undermined their lives and have really jeopardized the well-being of family members. But ultimately, these are dumb, foolish mistakes, sometimes undertaken in moments of diminished capacity because of multiple life stresses that the person has experienced over many years, including perhaps even complex trauma, but that the client is really not evil. The client is, in many other ways, frankly, a decent human being who has, unfortunately, taken a pathway towards wrongdoing. But, the subtleties of the person's remorse for having gotten on this path cannot really, I think, adequately be captured through paper and pencil testing. Another very important issue is that, and this is key, it's widely thought that we make our decisions based on rationality. This is hugely assumed in economics, a large part of research psychology, and frankly, law. It's not true. We make our decisions based on our emotions. We make our decisions based on how we feel about things. And then when the decision is made and we're in the thick of it, we rationalize our decisions retroactively, looking back and trying to explain our judgment. So it's very important to understand that when looking at testing, we need to ask ourselves, is the test ultimately going to reflect rationality, the theoretical rational decision-making of the client, or is it going to more properly capture, as it should, the client's emotions and feelings that brought this client to a moment of wrongdoing? I also really want to note that, having said all this, there are some real advantages of testing, particularly for children. Subtle cognitive issues such as processing speed and so on, I think can be ferreted out through testing. With the elderly, sometimes a person may seem like they have cognitive decline due to dementia or cognitive decline due to something more specific, like Alzheimer's, when in fact the individual perhaps really is suffering from major depressive disorder and their ability to think has been diminished, their ability to focus and concentrate is not very strong. The individual's ability to process information is poor, and their memory has been hampered because of the major depressive disorder, but it's not dementia. There are various reasons where testing is helpful, and I'm not one to say throw out the baby with the bathwater. To the contrary, it's important to understand where different expertise can be helpful at different periods. I want to give you one example where I think testing and psychosocial evaluations really complement and balance one another. I've done a number of Adam Walsh Act cases for immigration defense lawyers. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Adam Walsh Act. It had a consequence outside of criminal law for immigration, where if an American is petitioning for his wife, for example, to get a green card, and that American citizen was previously convicted of a sex crime against a minor, for example, the American citizen has to show that the non-American, that his wife will be at no risk of harm if she resides with him. And I've had a couple of cases that I did early on where a person expert in testing in this area would provide a paper and pencil test to the client regarding risk to the wife or anybody else, including beneficiaries such as children, which are called derivative beneficiaries. And I would then do a psychosocial evaluation, looking at this person's background, life, development, psychiatric issues, and so on, community ties, family, and if from my perspective there's any risk to the spouse. And what I have found is that this particular strategy is helpful because the testing that may have been done by a tester and my psychosocial evaluation will complement and balance one another. I think people who read these kinds of cases view the testing as very objective and view the psychosocial clinical forensic evaluation as, frankly, much more subjective. It's not so simple. In many ways, the test can be very subjective in the sense that conclusions drawn by the expert are ultimately the expert's own professional conclusions. by the same token, a psychosocial evaluation is in many ways very objective in terms of the issues that are asked about, the information that's elicited, the categories, certainly the concerns from a clinical mental health point of view are very objective, the criteria and so on. So in some ways, when testing is viewed as objective only, when psychosocial clinical evaluations are viewed as subjective, it's really a misguided understanding of those kinds of tools. With a psychosocial evaluation, as opposed to testing, we look at almost everything. The psychosocial evaluation, it's a strategic and systemic tool that provides an in-depth understanding about the client, his world, and issues. And in turn, the lawyer may develop strategies and avenues to understand the client better. The psychosocial assessment is conducted in order to understand the client for many particular considerations, including childhood development issues, stressors, traumas, challenges, quality of relationships to immediate and extended family members, sometimes called psychodynamics, the individual's health, including obviously psychopathology, interaction with home, environment, community, motivation, decision-making, sometimes called psychodynamics, perceptions of people and issues, sometimes referred to as object relations, and finally, the humanization of the client's needs, and so on. This is integrative. It's not that you're asking about one particular issue at a time and then going in order sequentially. The client must be understood systemically in a holistic way. In contrast, when you have a paper and pencil test, you're focusing on specific issues and getting replies about specific issues, but it's difficult to integrate and understand how those issues are all connected to one another, particularly if you're using multiple tests. I would also note that testing, it's often understood, is conducted by PhDs. The first thing you should know is that many PhDs are not clinicians. Clinicians are people who are licensed to be clinicians. Many PhDs in psychology complete their program and they do research of various kinds. Or they may go into industry or whatnot, or teaching or whatever it is, or a combination most often. Many people who do testing actually are clinical PhDs, but also many people that do testing do not have PhDs at all. You don't have to have a PhD to do testing. In fact, I don't know if you have to be licensed to do testing. In New York City, please don't quote me on this, but I believe I'm correct, there is, as you can imagine, a huge number of children that are tested and retested as they move through from elementary school through middle school and high school for a wide range of concerns and developmental problems or learning delays of various kinds. It would be very expensive to have these individuals tested by PhDs, and many of the people who do testing, not just for New York City, but in private offices as well, don't have doctorates. They may have undergraduate degrees or master's degrees or whatnot, and sometimes they're supervised by PhDs. So it's also important for lawyers to understand that don't make assumptions about who's doing testing and what kind of testing is being done and for what reason. There are also tests, and this is another matter that you really need to consider, which are very controversial. And one that is very well known is the Rorschach. These are ink blot tests in which the individual looks at an ink blot and projects what they understand about the shape, the parameters of the object, the black blob on the white paper, as a means to, in theory, understand internal issues within the person's psychological well-being. Some people swear by them. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who have written saying that they are of no value whatsoever. And there are those in the middle that believe that it has value, but that the Rorschach test really has to be undertaken by someone with particular expertise, and even then, not everybody can properly interpret the results. But I'm saying this to really express the idea that some testing is more readily accepted by others, whereas there's a sort of general view among some lawyers that all testing is universally accepted, and it's not really true. There is also many different kinds of tests you can give. For example, if you want to give a test to understand or determine if someone has clinical depression or if they're contending with depressive symptomatology, there's not a single test you can give. There's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different kinds of tests, which might be generally used in the United States and even generally accepted. Why one test is used versus another is one question. And the second question is, we're giving 3 tests to this client on one day and 3 tests to the same client on another day yield the same results. Will it give you the same clinical picture? Will the same clinical criteria be recognized through these different sets of tests? So these are just some of the major concerns I have about testing. Hopefully we'll pick up on it at another time. It's something that clients have asked about. It's something that lawyers have asked about. I just got an email, I think on Tuesday or Wednesday about this, and so I'm answering this through the YouTube video. I hope it was helpful. As usual, please do not hesitate to email me. I'd be more than happy to continue answering your emails. Thank you for sending them in. Emails are better than phone calls generally. In terms of my own information, please, if you're interested, look at my website. It has my books and my other work and so on. I hope this was helpful on this Sunday morning, October 27th. Have a great day. Thank you.